Jonestown, the 1978 massacre, where 918 died in 1978. 918 people died in the jungle of Guyana, South America. All members of a religious community, all followers of a charismatic preacher. The deaths were mass murder disguised as revolutionary suicide. The perpetrator wasn't a foreign government, wasn't a terrorist organization, wasn't even a deranged lone gunman. He was Jim Jones, a socialist minister who convinced nearly 1,000 Americans to drink cyanide-laced fruit punch. The U.S. government would later call it the largest single loss of American civilian life in a deliberate act until September 11, 2001. But the reason behind the bloodshed wasn't religious devotion, wasn't political ideology, wasn't even mass delusion. It was power, absolute control over people who'd surrendered their will completely, and one man's determination that if he couldn't live forever, his followers would die with him. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme psychological manipulation and mass death based on real events. San Francisco sprawled across 47 square miles of hills and fog in 1977. Population pushing towards 700,000, scattered between Victorian homes, public housing projects, and gleaming downtown towers. It was the kind of place where radical politics mixed with spiritual seeking, where counterculture refugees from the failed promises of the 1960s searched for meaning in communes and cults, and where the biggest news oscillated between the rise of gay rights activism and the growing homelessness crisis. The city had become a haven for alternative lifestyles and unconventional thinking after the Summer of Love in 1967. A decade later, that openness had curdled into something darker. Charles Manson had shown what charismatic leaders could do with vulnerable followers. The Symbionese Liberation Army had kidnapped Patty Hearst. Dozens of new religious movements competed for souls and donations on street corners throughout the city. But 1977 was also a year of genuine progressive change in San Francisco. Harvey Milk, the city's first openly gay supervisor, was pushing for civil rights protections. The People's Temple, a racially integrated church led by Reverend Jim Jones, was being praised by the city's political establishment as a model of social justice activism. Mayor George Moscone credited the temple with helping him win election. The People's Temple had its main church in the Fillmore district, a predominantly African-American neighborhood that had been devastated by urban renewal projects in the 1960s. The temple offered food programs, drug rehabilitation, free healthcare, and a vision of racial equality that seemed utopian to people tired of watching America break its promises. Members were predominantly black, working class, many of them elderly women who'd lived through Jim Crow and seen their children die in Vietnam. But beneath the surface, something darker was growing. Temple members who tried to leave reported being threatened and harassed. Defectors told stories of physical abuse, forced labor, and financial exploitation. Jones was demanding total loyalty, total commitment, total surrender of individual will. The People's Temple Agricultural Project in Guyana, South America, represented Jim Jones's ultimate vision. A socialist paradise in the jungle, 3,800 miles from San Francisco, where racial equality wasn't just preached but lived, where capitalism's corrupting influence couldn't reach, where his followers could build heaven on earth. Isolated from the enemies Jones insisted were everywhere, plotting to destroy them. Guyana itself was a small country on the northern coast of South America, squeezed between Venezuela, Suriname, and Brazil. Former British colony, gained independence in 1966. Population barely 800,000. The interior was dense rainforest, largely unmapped, inhabited mainly by indigenous peoples, and accessible only by small plane or boat. The jungle where Jonestown was carved provided everything needed for isolation. Impenetrable rainforest in every direction. The nearest town, Port Kaituma, 6 miles away on a muddy road, and heat that stayed above 85 degrees with 90% humidity year-round. Medical care was minimal. Communication with the outside world depended on a single shortwave radio. The Guyanese government presence was theoretical at best. In Jonestown, Jim Jones's word was law. James Warren Jones was 47 years old in November 1978, though he looked older, ravaged by drug addiction and paranoia. 6 feet tall, gaunt from an amphetamine habit that had him taking hundreds of pills per week. His hands trembled constantly, side effect of the uppers and downers. He mixed to stay functional. He wore dark sunglasses at all times now, even indoors at night, hiding eyes that had once been hypnotic but were now hollow and wild. Born May 13, 1931. In Crete, Indiana, Jim Jones entered the world during the depths of the Great Depression. His father, James Jones, was a World War I veteran, disabled by mustard gas exposure, unemployed and angry, who spent most days drunk and ranting about communists. His mother, Lynetta Jones, was an eccentric woman who claimed Cherokee ancestry and believed her son was destined for greatness. The reincarnation of Jesus Christ, or Vladimir Lenin, or some combination of both. Young Jim was a strange child by all accounts. He conducted elaborate funerals for dead animals he found or killed. He preached to other children, demanding they follow his rules for games and threatening them with hellfire if they disobeyed. He was obsessed with religion, attending every church in town regardless of denomination, studying their techniques for moving crowds and extracting commitment. By age 10, he was giving sermons on street corners, practicing the cadence and emotional manipulation he'd use for the next 4 decades. He married Marceline Baldwin in 1949, when he was 18 and she was 21, a nursing student who found his intensity romantic rather than disturbing. They had 1 biological son and adopted 7 children, creating what Jim called a rainbow family of different races to demonstrate his commitment to integration. Marceline became his enabler, making excuses for his affairs and abuse, protecting him from consequences. Trapped in a marriage to a man she'd slowly realized was either divinely inspired or completely insane. Jones founded the People's Temple in Indianapolis in 1955, during the height of American racial segregation. His church was integrated from the beginning, radical for its time and place. He preached a mixture of Christianity and socialism, telling poor black and white congregants that Jesus was a revolutionary who opposed economic exploitation and that heaven wasn't in the afterlife, but could be built right here through collective action and sacrifice. But even early on, the darkness was visible to those who looked closely. Jones faked healings, using information gathered by temple members to create the illusion of supernatural knowledge. He demanded absolute loyalty from followers, creating an inner circle sworn to secrecy about his methods. He had affairs with both male and female members while preaching about the evils of attachment to individuals. He told followers that attachment to biological family was bourgeois, that the temple was their real family. That loyalty to him superseded all other bonds. By 1965, Jones had moved his church to Northern California, settling first in Redwood Valley near Ukiah, then expanding to San Francisco and Los Angeles. He'd convinced his followers that nuclear war was imminent, that he'd received a divine vision of the safest places on earth, that only by following him could they survive. California offered more liberal attitudes toward integration and socialism, a larger pool of potential converts, and proximity to the counterculture movement with its thousands of young people searching for meaning. Every morning in Jonestown, Jim Jones woke around noon after being unconscious from drug-induced stupor since dawn. He'd stumble to the bathroom of his private cabin, the only air-conditioned building in the settlement, and inject himself with a cocktail of amphetamines to counteract the previous night's sedatives. He'd check his appearance in the mirror, noting how much older he looked than his 47 years. Seeing his father's alcoholic deterioration reflected back at him, he'd shower using the precious water that other residents could only dream of. Dress in his standard uniform of dark polyester pants and short-sleeved shirt. Don his sunglasses and emerge to begin his daily performance. Because everything Jones did in Jonestown was performance, carefully calculated to maintain control over increasingly skeptical followers who traveled 3,800 miles based on promises he couldn't keep. What Jim Jones valued most wasn't truth, wasn't genuine human connection, wasn't building the socialist paradise he promised. Though he preached constantly about equality and collective good, what he valued was power, absolute and unchallenged. His grandfather had been a revivalist preacher who controlled congregations through fear and ecstasy. His father had been a tyrant in his own home, violent and unpredictable. Jones had absorbed both models, creating a leadership style that combined religious fervor with totalitarian control. The People's Temple itself represented everything to Jones. His identity was completely merged with the organization. If the temple succeeded, he was a messiah. If it failed, he was nothing, just another con man exposed and destroyed. By late 1978, the temple was failing, hemorrhaging members through defections, facing legal investigations and hostile media coverage, running out of money as Jones's drug habit consumed resources. The socialist paradise was revealing itself as a prison camp where malnourished residents worked 12-hour days and were punished for the smallest infractions. Jones knew the end was coming, sensed it with the instinct of someone who'd built his entire life on lies and manipulation. The congressman was coming to investigate, bringing reporters. Defectors were providing detailed accounts of abuse. The U.S. government was finally paying attention. His options were narrowing to surrender and face prosecution, or something more dramatic. Something that would ensure he'd never be forgotten. Never be just another failed cult leader arrested and imprisoned. By November 1978, Jim Jones had become a pharmaceutical zombie, consuming massive quantities of drugs that would have killed most people. Pentobarbital to sleep, Quaaludes to relax, amphetamines to wake up, Valium to manage anxiety, all mixed with whatever else he could get his hands on. His thinking was increasingly paranoid and delusional. He believed the CIA was planning to invade Jonestown, that mercenaries were surrounding the settlement, that enemies were poisoning his food and programming his followers to assassinate him. The revolution he'd preached for decades, the workers' paradise he'd promised, had collapsed into a nightmare of his own creation. 7 days a week of forced labor in tropical heat, meager rations of rice and beans while he ate steak and drank liquor. Punishment for infractions ranging from beatings to being drugged and placed in a wooden box for days. Loyalty tests where he'd wake everyone at 3 a.m. with air raid sirens and force them to pledge their willingness to die for the cause. He'd conducted dozens of rehearsals for what he called revolutionary suicide, gathering everyone in the pavilion, distributing what he claimed was poisoned punch, timing how long it took 1,000 people to drink. They'd survived each time, Jones explaining it was just a test of their commitment. But the psychological conditioning was complete. When the real poison came, people would drink because they'd been trained to obey, trained to believe that death was preferable to losing, trained to see suicide as the ultimate revolutionary act. The members of People's Temple weren't brainwashed zombies or mindless cultists, though that's how history would remember them. They were real people with real dreams who'd made rational decisions based on information they had at the time. slowly finding themselves trapped in a situation that had transformed from hopeful to horrifying, so gradually they couldn't pinpoint when it happened. The majority were African American, many of them elderly women who'd lived through Jim Crow segregation in the South, migrated to California seeking better lives, and found in the People's Temple the racial equality they'd been promised by the civil rights movement but never fully achieved. They'd watched Martin Luther King Jr. assassinated, watched Black Panthers murdered by police, watched their neighborhoods destroyed by drugs and urban renewal. Jim Jones offered something different. A place where black and white members were genuinely equal, where their voices mattered, where their labor was valued. Others were young white radicals who'd been involved in anti-war protests, civil rights activism, or the counterculture movement. They'd seen the establishment crush dissent, watched Nixon and Reagan dismantle social programs, felt the hope of the 1960s curdle into the cynicism of the 1970s. Jones spoke their language, validated their anger, offered a way to build revolution rather than just protest injustice. The fact that his revolution required absolute obedience and surrender of individual autonomy seemed like a reasonable trade-off for the chance to change the world. There were also families, multiple generations who joined together. Parents bringing children, grandparents following grandchildren, siblings recruiting siblings. Once a few family members joined, the social pressure to stay became overwhelming. Leaving meant abandoning loved ones, being branded a traitor, possibly never seeing your own children again if they remained loyal to Jones. The temple deliberately separated families, assigned housing to break up nuclear family units, encouraged children to report parents' disloyalty. All techniques borrowed from Maoist China and Soviet Russia. These weren't stupid people, weren't uneducated people, weren't people who lacked critical thinking skills. The temple included teachers, nurses, lawyers, skilled tradespeople, people with college degrees and professional accomplishments. They'd been systematically manipulated through techniques that intelligence agencies and totalist movements had perfected over decades. Sleep deprivation, information control, public confessions of disloyalty, positive reinforcement for compliance, punishment for questioning, and gradual escalation of demands so that by the time they recognized the danger, they were already too compromised to escape. Christine Miller was 60 years old in November 1978, an African-American woman who'd been with the temple since the early days in California. She'd believed deeply in Jones's vision of racial equality and socialist transformation. She'd given her life savings to the cause, recruited friends and family, defended the temple against critics. But by the final day, she'd seen enough to question everything, to stand up in front of 1,000 people and argue that maybe dying wasn't the best option, that maybe they should try something else. Her courage would be captured on the final tape recording. Her voice calm and rational as she suggested alternatives to mass suicide. Jones's voice responding with manipulation and veiled threats. The crowd eventually wearing her down with shouts of revolutionary commitment until she fell silent. Christine Miller would drink the poison like everyone else. But she'd left evidence that not everyone went willingly, that some people saw through Jones's madness at the end, even if they couldn't escape it. Stanley Clayton was 25 years old, one of the young black men who'd grown up in the temple, worked in the settlement's construction crew, and still had enough independence of thought to recognize when things went wrong. On the final day, he'd managed to slip away into the jungle during the chaos of the congressman's visit, surviving by hiding until it was over. His testimony would provide crucial evidence about what happened, about Jones's drug use and paranoia, about the armed guards who prevented escape, about the gradual transformation from hopeful community to death camp. The children in Jonestown, 276 of them, had no choice at all. Babies and toddlers who'd been born into the temple or brought by believing parents. School-age children who'd been taken to Guyana with promises of adventure and education. Teenagers who'd grown up knowing nothing but Jones's ideology and control. They would die first, poison squirted into their mouths by nurses following orders. Their deaths used to eliminate any parent's hope of changing their mind. Because once your children are dead, what reason do you have to live? These families had known each other for years, some for decades. They'd worked together in the temple's various social programs, feeding the hungry, housing the homeless, providing childcare and elder care. They'd attended services together, celebrated holidays together, supported each other through personal crises. Their families had grown intertwined through marriages and adoptions, creating a web of connections that made leaving feel like tearing yourself apart. Jones had exploited those connections ruthlessly. He'd installed informants who reported any hint of disloyalty. He'd conducted catharsis sessions where members publicly confessed sins and disloyalty, creating leverage to use against them later. He'd convinced them that the outside world was filled with enemies, that defectors were traitors working with the CIA, that staying together was the only path to survival and salvation. By the time most members realized the depth of Jones's madness, they were in Guyana, passports confiscated, money gone, communication with the outside world controlled by temple leadership, surrounded by jungle that would kill you faster than the guards with rifles who patrolled the perimeter. The trap had closed completely, and the only way out appeared to be through death. The trouble had been building for years, accelerating through 1977 and into 1978 as defectors began telling their stories publicly, and journalists started investigating. But the specific incident that triggered the final catastrophe began on November 14, 1978, when Congressman Leo Ryan of California announced his intention to visit Jonestown to investigate allegations of human rights abuses. Ryan was 53 years old, a Democrat representing a district south of San Francisco that included many former temple members and concerned relatives of people still in Jonestown. He'd been contacted by the Concerned Relatives group, families desperate to know if their loved ones were being held against their will. Ryan took his congressional oversight responsibilities seriously, had a history of personally investigating issues rather than relying on staff reports. He'd gone undercover in Folsom Prison to expose conditions there. He'd embedded with American troops in Vietnam. Visiting a religious settlement in Guyana seemed straightforward by comparison. Jones had been dreading this visit for months. His power in Jonestown depended on controlling information, on preventing any outside authority from seeing the reality of what he'd created. The settlement was a fraud, the buildings shoddily constructed and already deteriorating, the agricultural project failing to produce enough food, the promised paradise revealed as a labor camp, where people worked dawn to dusk for subsistence rations and were punished for complaining. But refusing the congressman's visit would confirm every accusation being made. So Jones agreed, calculating he could manage the situation, show Ryan a sanitized version of Jonestown, convince him that the defectors were lying and the settlement was thriving. He'd done it before with other visitors, using his most articulate and loyal members to testify about how happy they were, hiding the armed guards and punishment boxes, serving decent food for once, and making sure everyone smiled. On November 17th, Congressman Ryan arrived in Georgetown, Guyana's capital, with a delegation that included 3 reporters, a photographer, and representatives from the Concerned Relatives group. The Guyanese government, embarrassed by growing negative press about Jonestown, was cooperating fully. Ryan planned to fly into Port Kaituma, travel to Jonestown, conduct interviews, and return to Georgetown the next day. Simple, straightforward, no reason to expect violence. Jones spent that day in Jonestown preparing for Ryan's arrival, drugging himself into a paranoid frenzy while giving orders to present the best face possible. Members rehearsed their testimonials about how wonderful life was. The pavilion was decorated. A cultural show was planned with music and dancing. The kitchen prepared actual meals with meat and vegetables instead of the usual rice and beans. Jones coached his inner circle on how to respond to questions, threatened severe punishment for anyone who spoke honestly to the congressman. Everything was tension and fear. The members knew this was their last chance to escape, that if they told Ryan the truth, he might help them leave. But they also knew Jones had armed guards loyal to him, that attempting escape could mean death, that their children and elderly parents might be killed in retaliation. The decision each person faced was impossible. Stay and continue suffering with some hope of eventual escape, or risk everything on a congressman's ability to protect them from a man who'd proven willing to kill to maintain control. Not just the congressman's visit created that tension, but years of escalating control and abuse condensed into one moment of potential exposure. Every instance of physical punishment Jones had inflicted, every time he'd forced sexual encounters on members while preaching against attachment, every penny he'd stolen from people who'd given everything, every lie he'd told about conditions in Jonestown and the progress of their revolution. All of it was about to be revealed if even one person found the courage to speak truth to the congressman. Jones stood in his cabin on the evening of November 17th, just staring at the shortwave radio that connected him to the outside world he'd tried so hard to escape. His breathing came shallow and fast. His hands trembled with a combination of drug withdrawal and mounting panic. When he finally emerged for the evening meeting, his mind had already calculated the endgame. There were voices in his head now, whether from the drugs or genuine psychosis, or the logical conclusion of his own paranoid ideology. They told him that Ryan was CIA, that the reporters were assassins, that the visit was cover for a military invasion. They told him that the only revolutionary response was to refuse surrender, to choose death over capture, to make a statement so dramatic that history would remember Jonestown as martyrdom rather than failure. What wasn't debatable was that Jim Jones had clearly decided his entire community needed to die that very evening. Sometime between Ryan's arrival announcement and the congressman's actual appearance, the decision crystallized from vague threat to concrete plan. He would kill them all. Members, children, everyone who'd followed him into the jungle. And he'd frame it as their choice, as revolutionary suicide, as the ultimate act of defiance against an oppressive capitalist system that left them no other option. On November 18, 1978, at approximately 3 p.m., Congressman Leo Ryan arrived in Jonestown after a muddy 6-mile drive from the Port Katuma airstrip. He came with reporters, photographers, and concerned relatives, carrying photographs of family members they hoped to contact. Jones greeted them with forced friendliness, sweat staining his shirt despite the late afternoon heat being normal. His hands shaking so badly, he had to clasp them behind his back. The congressman and his delegation were shown around carefully selected parts of Jonestown. The freshly painted buildings, the agricultural areas that looked most productive, the school where children recited prepared statements about how much they loved their community. Jones had drugged himself into a kind of manic coherence, answering Ryan's questions with practiced deflections, claiming that reports of abuse were CIA propaganda designed to destroy a successful socialist experiment. But Jones couldn't control everything, couldn't watch everyone simultaneously. As the congressman conducted interviews in the pavilion, people began slipping him notes. Small pieces of paper pressed into his hand during handshakes. Whispered requests for help when Jones's attention was elsewhere. Desperate pleas from people who'd been waiting years for this opportunity and understood might never come again. "I want to leave," one note read. Then another. Then more. 15 people, then 16. Families and individuals who'd found the courage to publicly defect, who told Ryan they were being held against their will and wanted his help to escape. Jones's carefully constructed facade collapsed as members openly contradicted his claims about how happy everyone was. "Congressman Ryan," Jones said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage, "these people are free to leave any time. We don't hold people here. If they want to go, they can go." But his face betrayed him, the muscles tight with fury, his body language threatening despite the words. Everyone in Jonestown knew what happened to people who openly defected, the punishment that awaited, the retaliation against family members left behind. The armed guards positioned around the pavilion weren't subtle, weren't accidental. They were Jones's enforcers, loyal members who'd proven willing to use violence to maintain order. Ryan agreed to take the defectors with him, a larger group than his small plane could accommodate in one trip. They'd need to make multiple flights from Port Kaituma airstrip to get everyone out. Jones agreed through gritted teeth, maintaining the fiction that everyone was free, while his inner circle radioed ahead to Port Kaituma with orders that would become clear soon enough. As the congressman prepared to leave, one of Jones's most loyal followers attacked him with a knife. A half-hearted attempt that was quickly stopped, but that signaled how close to violence the situation had become. Ryan was shaken but unhurt, eager now to get his group out of Jonestown as quickly as possible. They loaded into trucks and trailers for the drive to Port Kaituma, defectors clutching hastily packed bags, family members saying hurried goodbyes, children crying in confusion. The delegation arrived at Port Kaituma airstrip around 4:45 p.m. Two small planes were waiting, a Twin Otter and a Cessna, enough to evacuate most of the group in one load with a second trip planned for the remainder. They began boarding, relaxing slightly now that they were away from Jonestown, believing the danger had passed, already mentally composing the stories they'd tell about what they'd seen. Then a tractor and trailer from Jonestown emerged from the tree line, driving directly onto the airstrip. Armed men jumped down, including Temple Security Chief Larry Layton, who'd pretended to defect and boarded the smaller plane. The shooting started instantly, systematic and deliberate, targeting the congressman first to eliminate leadership, then the reporters to prevent documentation, then anyone who tried to run or fight back. Leo Ryan died on the airstrip, shot more than 20 times at close range. NBC reporter Don Harris died filming the attack, his camera still running as bullets tore through him. San Francisco Examiner photographer Greg Robinson died trying to get under the plane for cover. 3 others died, including a defecting Temple member. 11 people were wounded, some critically. Larry Layton shot people inside the smaller plane before being subdued by survivors. The entire attack lasted less than 5 minutes, executed with military efficiency by people who'd clearly planned this, who'd rehearsed scenarios where outside intervention required violent response. Then the gunmen returned to their vehicle and drove back toward Jonestown, leaving dead and wounded scattered across the red dirt airstrip, leaving survivors in shock and horror, leaving evidence of massacre that would alert the world to what was happening in the jungle. Back in Jonestown, Jones heard the radio report that the mission was accomplished, that Ryan was dead, that the reporters were neutralized. His face showed no emotion, no remorse, just cold calculation of his remaining options. He picked up the microphone connected to the settlement's loudspeaker system and made the announcement that would define Jonestown's place in history. Everyone to the pavilion immediately. This is not a drill. Everyone to the pavilion now. It was 5 p.m. on November 18th when Jim Jones summoned his entire community to the central pavilion for what he called a white night, his term for the emergency meetings he'd conducted dozens of times before, practice sessions for revolutionary suicide that had always ended with everyone surviving. But those who'd been paying attention recognized that something was different this time, that the congressman's visit and the airstrip attack had eliminated any possibility of peaceful resolution. The pavilion was an open-sided building with a metal roof. Benches arranged in rows facing a small stage where Jones held court. Guards positioned themselves at the exits, not obviously threatening but present, armed, watching for anyone who might try to run. Mothers held babies, elderly members helped each other to seats. Teenagers sat together wondering what fresh crisis Jones would manufacture this time. Jones took the microphone. His voice amplified through speakers mounted on poles throughout the settlement. He looked worse than usual, sweat-soaked and trembling, his sunglasses failing to hide eyes that were simultaneously vacant and wild. When he spoke, his words came in the practiced cadence of a preacher, but with an edge of finality that hadn't been there before. "How very much I've loved you," Jones began, his voice almost tender. "How very much I've tried my best to give you a good life. In spite of all that I've tried, a handful of our people, with their lies, have made our lives impossible." He explained about the congressman's visit, about the defectors, about what he claimed was CIA involvement. He told them that Guyanese forces were planning to invade Jonestown, that mercenaries were surrounding them, that there was no escape and no future except torture and imprisonment. Better to die with dignity, he argued, than live as slaves or let their children be tortured by fascists. I never thought that ever in a million years I would be at this point. It's better to die in revolutionary suicide, protesting the conditions of an inhumane world, Jones declared, his voice rising to match the apocalyptic vision he'd been building for years. Large metal vats had been prepared, filled with grape-flavored flavor aid mixed with cyanide, Valium, chloral hydrate, and promethazine. The mixture was lethal and fast-acting, designed to cause death through cyanide poisoning within minutes, while the sedatives eased the transition. Nurses and medical staff, people who'd taken oaths to preserve life, lined up to distribute poison to a community they'd served for years. Children were brought forward first, Jones explaining that this way was kinder than watching parents die first. Mothers took their babies, accepted syringes filled with poison, and squirted the mixture into tiny mouths. The children began dying within minutes, cyanide causing convulsions and agony that Jones tried to characterize as peaceful sleep. Screaming children, crying babies, parents sobbing as they murdered their own offspring, following orders from a man who'd convinced them this was love rather than horror. Christine Miller, the 60-year-old woman who'd believed in Jones for decades, stood up to challenge him one final time. Her voice, captured on the tape recording Jones insisted on making, was calm and rational despite the chaos surrounding her. "I think there are too many people here that have children. I think we should go to Russia," she suggested, proposing an alternative to immediate death, arguing that the community could evacuate to the Soviet Union, where they'd claimed to have supporters. Jones dismissed her suggestions with a combination of manipulation and veiled threats. "How are you going to get there? How are you going to get to Russia? You think Russia's going to want us with all this stigma?" Others in the crowd, whether through genuine belief or understanding that dissent was futile, shouted her down. "We're ready. We're ready," they chanted, the mob mentality overwhelming individual doubt, peer pressure accomplishing what Jones's rhetoric alone might not have achieved. Christine Miller fell silent, defeated not by Jones's arguments, but by the collective commitment to die that had been conditioned over years of loyalty. Tests and practice sessions. Adults began lining up at the vats, accepting cups or syringes filled with poison, walking to the edges of the pavilion to die. Some went willingly, believing Jones's promise that this was revolutionary protest and they'd be celebrated as martyrs. Others went reluctantly, accepting that escape was impossible with armed guards watching and jungle surrounding them. Still others were murdered, poison forced into resisting mouths, shot when they tried to run, injected when they refused to drink. The deaths weren't peaceful despite Jones's narration. Cyanide causes excruciating pain, seizures, loss of bodily control, a brutal 3 to 5 minutes of agony before unconsciousness and death. The pavilion became a scene of horror as people convulsed and vomited. Children screamed and cried. The lucky ones who'd been given extra sedatives drifted off, but most died in pain despite Jones's soothing words over the loudspeaker. "Die with respect. Die with a degree of dignity," Jones ordered, his voice growing more agitated as the reality of what he'd set in motion became impossible to deny. "Don't lay down with tears and agony. I tell you, I don't care how many screams you hear. I don't care how many anguished cries. Death is 1,000,000 times preferable to 10 more days of this life." The tape recording captured it all. Children crying, "I don't want to die." Parents pleading for their children to be spared. Jones alternating between soothing reassurance and angry demands for compliance. The sounds of 1,000 people dying over approximately 45 minutes. The largest mass murder-suicide in modern history. Orchestrated by a man whose charisma and manipulation had convinced them that death was revolutionary, rather than surrender to a madman's delusion. Stanley Clayton, the 25-year-old construction worker who'd managed to slip away during the congressman's visit, hid in the jungle through the night of November 18th, listening to the sounds emanating from Jonestown. The screaming children, the pleading parents, the poisonous rhetoric from Jones's loudspeaker, all of it audible even from his hiding spot a quarter-mile away. He stayed hidden through the night, terrified that guards would find him, waiting for silence before attempting to walk the 6 miles to Port Ketuma. Other survivors escaped in various ways. Some temple members who'd been in Georgetown or Port Ketuma when the massacre occurred returned to find their entire families dead. Others managed to flee into the jungle during the chaos, including several of Jones's own sons who'd been playing basketball in the capital when their father murdered their community. Fewer than 90 temple members survived out of the more than 1,000 who'd been in Jonestown that final month. Guyanese defense. 4 soldiers and American embassy officials didn't reach Jonestown until the morning of November 19th, more than 12 hours after the dying ended. What they found defied comprehension. Bodies everywhere, scattered across the pavilion and surrounding area, arranged in family groups, babies clutched in mothers' arms. The elderly positioned near the vats where they'd received their poison. Over 900 corpses in various states of decomposition in tropical heat. The scene was horrifying in its scale and intimacy. A grandmother holding her grandchildren, all dead. Teenage couples embracing as the poison took effect. Children arranged in rows, murdered systematically and efficiently by nurses following Jones's orders. And at the center of it all, Jim Jones himself, dead from a single gunshot wound to the head, whether self-inflicted or administered by a loyal follower, remaining uncertain. The logistics of processing the scene overwhelmed everyone involved. Over 900 bodies in a remote jungle location accessible only by small plane or helicopter. Tropical heat causing rapid decomposition, making identification difficult and creating a public health crisis. Guyanese authorities wanted the bodies removed immediately. American authorities needed to identify victims and determine cause of death. Families wanted their loved ones returned for burial. And nobody had the resources or experience to handle a mass casualty event of this magnitude. The U.S. Air Force eventually transported the bodies to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, using C-141 cargo planes. An operation that took over a week and required more than 30 flights. Forensic pathologists worked around the clock to identify victims through dental records, fingerprints, and personal effects. A process complicated by the sheer number of bodies and the sheer condition they deteriorated to in the jungle heat, The public reaction was shock, horror, and an uncomfortable recognition that nearly 1,000 Americans had been manipulated into committing mass murder-suicide by a charismatic leader who'd been praised by politicians and media just months earlier. How had this happened? How had Jones operated openly in San Francisco for years, abusing members and stockpiling weapons without serious intervention? How had American citizens been allowed to establish a settlement in Guyana that operated as a totalitarian state with no oversight? Questions emerged about who was responsible beyond Jones himself. Had the San Francisco political establishment enabled him by accepting his support and overlooking warnings? Had the media failed by initially treating the temple as a legitimate social justice organization? Had the State Department neglected its duty to protect American citizens overseas? Had Guyanese officials ignored evidence of abuse because the temple brought development money? The concerned relatives group, who'd been desperately trying to get their family members out of Jonestown for years, expressed anguish that their warnings had been dismissed as persecution of an alternative religious community. They'd told anyone who would listen that Jones was dangerous, that members were being held against their will, that tragedy was inevitable if intervention didn't occur. Politicians and officials had dismissed them as disgruntled, former members, or overprotective. Parents unable to accept their adult children's choices. By the time the last body was identified and returned to families, 6 months had passed. 200 of the Jonestown victims had no one to claim them, no family willing or able to arrange burial, no resources even if family existed. They were buried in a mass grave at Evergreen Cemetery in Oakland, California, 409 individual caskets interred together because no funeral home wanted to handle the remains of cult members and no community wanted a memorial to mass suicide in their neighborhood. The temple's San Francisco headquarters was seized by authorities investigating financial crimes. Jones had diverted millions of dollars in members' assets, Social Security checks from elderly members, property deeds, and life savings. The money trail led to overseas bank accounts, cash transferred to the Soviet Union, and purchases of weapons and supplies. What had appeared to be a charitable organization was revealed as a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had exploited vulnerable people for decades. The trial of Larry Layton, the temple member who'd participated in the airstrip attack and survived, began in 1981 after years of legal proceedings. He was charged with conspiracy to murder Congressman Ryan and aiding and abetting the murder of one of the defectors. The prosecution had eyewitness testimony from survivors, had Layton's own actions captured on film by the dying reporter, had physical evidence linking him to the murders. This should have been straightforward, but Layton's defense argued that he was a victim of mind control, that years of psychological manipulation had eliminated his capacity for independent judgment, that he was as much a victim as those who died. The first trial ended in hung jury, the panel unable to agree whether Layton bore criminal responsibility for actions committed while under Jones's influence. The second trial, in 1986, resulted in conviction on conspiracy and aiding and abetting charges. Layton received a life sentence but was released after serving 18 years. His sentence commuted by President Clinton in 2002. He was the only person criminally prosecuted for the Jonestown deaths, the only individual held accountable for the murder of a congressman and 4 others for participating in the massacre. That left 918 people dead, including 276 children. Civil lawsuits against the temple's remaining assets provided some compensation to survivors and victims' families. But the financial trail was complex. Money hidden in overseas accounts or transferred to individuals who'd left Jonestown before the massacre. Most survivors received little beyond trauma and the burden of explaining for the rest of their lives why they'd followed Jim Jones into the jungle, The Guyanese government conducted its own investigation, eventually concluding that Jonestown had operated as a criminal enterprise on their soil, that Jones had violated numerous laws. But that prosecution was impossible, with the primary defendant dead and most accomplices dead alongside him. They bulldozed the settlement, erasing physical evidence of what had occurred there, wanting to distance their country from the atrocity that had occurred on their watch. The long-term consequences rippled for decades. Survivors struggled with PTSD, guilt, depression, and survivor's remorse. Many couldn't hold jobs or maintain relationships, couldn't trust authority figures or religious organizations, couldn't forgive themselves for not saving family members who died. Some survivors committed suicide years later, unable to live with memories of what they'd witnessed or participated in. Children who'd escaped Jonestown grew up with trauma that shaped their entire lives. They'd watched siblings and parents die, had been force-fed poison themselves, and survived when others didn't, had lost their entire communities, and been returned to a country that viewed them with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Many struggled with addiction, mental illness, and the particular burden of being Jonestown, survivors in a culture that couldn't understand what they'd experienced. The broader cultural impact was profound and lasting. Jonestown became shorthand for cult behavior, for the dangers of charismatic leadership and religious extremism, for the vulnerability of people seeking meaning in a complex world. The term, drinking the Kool-Aid, entered common usage, a grotesque reference to mass murder that trivializes the horror, while keeping the memory alive in distorted form. Religious scholars and psychologists studied Jonestown extensively, trying to understand how ordinary people could be manipulated into committing mass suicide. The mechanisms Jones used: sleep deprivation, information control, isolation from outside influences, public confessions, gradual escalation of demands, weren't unique to him. They'd been used by totalist movements throughout history, from Maoist China to North Korea to other destructive cults. Proven techniques for breaking down individual autonomy and replacing it with group identity. The most uncomfortable conclusion from studying Jonestown is that it could happen again, is happening again in smaller forms, that the human vulnerabilities Jones exploited, the desire for community and meaning and purpose, remain constant even as the specific forms of manipulation evolve. Charismatic leaders still emerge, still gather followers, still create isolated communities where dissent is punished and loyalty rewarded. And the warning signs are still dismissed until tragedy forces recognition. The deaths began at approximately 5:20 p.m. on November 18, 1978, 20 minutes after Jones summoned everyone to the pavilion. The sun was still up, temperature hovering around 85 degrees, with oppressive humidity that made breathing feel like work. The pavilion, which had hosted celebrations and meetings and church services for over a year, was about to become the site of the largest mass murder-suicide in modern history. Jones had positioned his most loyal followers strategically throughout the crowd. Armed guards at the exits, their rifles visible now rather than concealed, making clear that leaving wasn't an option. Nurses and medical staff near the vats of poison, ready to distribute death efficiently. Inner circle members scattered among the congregation to encourage compliance and identify potential resistors before they could organize opposition. Tape recording that Jones insisted on making captured everything, his voice alternating between soothing reassurance and angry demands. The sounds of children crying and adults pleading. The chaos as poison began taking effect, and people realized this wasn't another drill. The approximately 45 minutes it took for over 900 people to die, compressed onto magnetic tape, it would become one of the most disturbing audio documents in American history. Take the potion like they used to in ancient Greece, and step over quietly, because we are not committing suicide. It's a revolutionary act, Jones declared, his voice calm and assured despite the horror he was orchestrating. "We can't go back. They won't leave us alone. They're now going back to tell more lies, which means more congressmen. And there's no way we can survive." The children died first, Jones's strategy to eliminate any parent's motivation to resist. Mothers took their babies, accepted syringes filled with poison, and squirted the cyanide-laced mixture into tiny mouths it couldn't refuse. Couldn't understand? Couldn't consent. Infants who'd been born in Jonestown and never known any other life. Toddlers who'd just learned to walk and talk. School-age children who'd trusted adults to protect them. The cyanide worked quickly, but not painlessly. Within seconds of ingestion, the children began convulsing, their small bodies seizing as the poison shut down cellular respiration, essentially suffocating them from the inside. Their skin turned pink, then blue, as oxygen deprivation progressed. Some vomited, others lost control of bodily functions. All of them suffered in ways that Jones's narration tried to characterize as peaceful sleep, but that, medical evidence would later confirm, was excruciating. "Mother, mother, 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 please," a woman's voice pleaded on the tape, begging for her child's life, or perhaps begging to die herself after watching her child suffer. The crowd noise increased, some people crying, others chanting revolutionary slogans, the guards maintaining order through presence and implied threat. Adults began dying next, lining up at the vats in some semblance of order despite the chaos. Some went willingly, genuinely believing Jones's rhetoric about revolutionary martyrdom, convinced that their deaths would inspire others to resist capitalism and oppression. They drank quickly, walked to the edges of the pavilion to die, surrounded by community members. Held hands with friends as the poison took effect, singing revolutionary songs in weak voices until they could no longer breathe. Others went reluctantly, accepting that escape was impossible with armed guards watching every exit and jungle, surrounding the settlement in all directions. They drank slowly, crying, saying goodbye to loved ones, trying to maintain dignity in their final moments, even as they recognized the horror of what they were participating in. These people weren't believers anymore, weren't convinced by Jones's rhetoric, but saw no alternative except a bullet if they refused. Still others resisted actively, were murdered rather than committing suicide, even in its revolutionary framing. Guards forced poison into resisting mouths, held people down while nurses injected cyanide directly into veins, shot those who tried to run into the jungle. The evidence would later show that many of the dead had injection marks rather than poison in their stomachs, indicating they'd been murdered when they refused to drink voluntarily. The tape captured Christine Miller's final attempt at resistance, her voice weary, but still trying logic against Jones's manipulation. "But I look at all the babies, and I think they deserve to live, you know," she said, appealing to the crowd's humanity, to the basic recognition that murdering children is wrong regardless of revolutionary justification. The crowd shouted her down, whether from genuine belief or fear of being identified as disloyal. "We're ready. We're ready," they chanted, the collective voice drowning out individual dissent. Peer pressure, accomplishing what Jones's rhetoric alone might not have achieved. This was the culmination of years of loyalty tests and practice sessions, conditioning that had trained them to follow orders even unto death. Jones continued his narration as the dying accelerated. "Please get us some medication. It's simple. It's simple. There's no convulsions with it. It's just simple. Just please get it before it's too late. The GDF will be here, I tell you. Get moving, get moving. Don't be afraid to die. You'll see, there'll be a few people land out here. They'll torture some of our children here. They'll torture our people. They'll torture our seniors. We cannot have this. The GDF, Guyana Defense Force, wasn't coming to torture anyone. Jones's paranoid delusion had constructed a fantasy where military invasion was imminent, where American and Guyanese forces were planning to imprison or kill everyone in Jonestown. No such invasion was planned or occurring, but the lie served his purpose, creating urgency that overwhelmed rational thought, forcing immediate action before people had time to question or organize resistance. By 5:45 p.m., the pavilion was a scene of absolute horror. Bodies everywhere, sprawled across benches and floors, arranged in family groups, mothers clutching children, elderly members positioned near where they'd received their poison. The smell was overwhelming. Cyanide has an almond-like scent that mixed with vomit and bodily fluids released in death. The sounds had diminished from screaming and pleading to moaning and gasping as the dying progressed and resistance became impossible. Temple Dr. Larry Schacht, who'd helped prepare the poison, was among the dead. He'd killed himself after ensuring that the cyanide mixture was lethal and the distribution was proceeding efficiently. Temple nurse Annie Moore died alongside her mother, both of them killed by the medicine they'd spent their lives protecting. The very people trained to preserve life had become instruments of mass murder, their professional ethics overridden by loyalty to Jones and belief in his revolutionary vision. Maria Katsaris, Jones's mistress and one of his most trusted advisors, died near him. She'd been instrumental in maintaining control over Jonestown, in enforcing discipline, in identifying potential defectors. Her reward for loyalty was death alongside everyone else, because in Jones's final calculation, nobody was special enough to survive, except possibly himself. The deaths continued past 6 p.m. as the last resistors were forced to drink or were murdered by guards following orders. Some people had hidden in buildings trying to escape, were hunted down and killed. Others tried to run into the jungle, were shot by perimeter guards, or caught and dragged back to receive poison. The settlement that had promised paradise became a killing field where every avenue of escape had been eliminated. Through years of careful planning and psychological conditioning, Jim Jones himself died from a gunshot wound to the head, the only gunshot death among the hundreds of cyanide poisonings. Whether he shot himself or had a loyal follower shoot him remains debated. The positioning of the gun and trajectory of the bullet suggested self-infliction, but Jones's advanced drug addiction and physical deterioration raised questions about whether he had the coordination to shoot himself accurately. His death denied him accountability, denied survivors and victims' families the satisfaction of seeing him prosecuted and imprisoned. By 6:30 p.m., the killing was complete. Over 900 bodies in various states of decomposition in tropical heat, arranged throughout the pavilion and surrounding area. The settlement that had housed over 1,000 people just hours earlier was now silent, except for a few wounded survivors who'd played dead or hidden successfully, and the armed guards who'd participated in the massacre and were now contemplating their own futures. Some guards killed themselves in the hours after the main massacre. Others fled into the jungle, attempting to escape to Venezuela or Brazil before authorities arrived. A few remained at the settlement, maintaining their posts even as they realized the magnitude of what they'd participated in. Uncertain what to do now that Jones's orders had led to catastrophe rather than revolution. The sun set over Jonestown around 6:45 p.m., darkness falling quickly in the equatorial jungle. The settlement had no electricity in most buildings, so the pavilion area went dark, except for a few battery-powered lights. The bodies remained where they'd fallen. Tropical insects already beginning their work, the heat accelerating decomposition, the crime scene deteriorating by the hour while survivors in Port Kaituma tried to convince skeptical authorities that something terrible had happened in the jungle settlement. The first external confirmation of the massacre came from the wounded survivors at Port Katuma airstrip, who had been transported to a local hospital and were giving accounts of what had happened. But their stories were so extreme, so unlikely, that initial reports suggested maybe a dozen people had died at Jonestown, not hundreds. The scale of what Jones had orchestrated seemed impossible. Beyond what anyone imagined, one man could convince 1,000 people to do. Guyanese Defense Force soldiers and American embassy officials reached Jonestown on the morning of November 19th, flying in by helicopter because the road from Port Katuma was uncertain and possibly defended by armed temple members. What they found exceeded the worst imaginable scenarios. Bodies everywhere, hundreds visible from the air before they even landed. More bodies discovered as they searched buildings and outlying areas. The initial body count was 408, leading to worldwide headlines about over 400 dead in mass suicide. But that count was wrong, catastrophically wrong, because bodies were layered on top of each other in family groups, because children's bodies were hidden beneath adults who died clutching them, because the sheer scale overwhelmed the first responders who conducted the initial survey. Over the next 2 days, as bodies were carefully separated and moved, the true count emerged: 909, then 913, finally settling at 918 total dead, including Jim Jones. The logistical nightmare of processing the scene was unprecedented. No one had experience with mass casualty events of this scale outside of warfare or natural disasters. The bodies were in various states of decomposition after sitting in 85-degree heat and 90% humidity for 12 to 36 hours. Identification was difficult. Many victims carried no ID. Families were intermixed, making it unclear who belonged to whom. And the cyanide poisoning had left distinctive physical markers that made viewing difficult, even for EXPERIENCED personnel. The U.S. military was called in to handle the recovery operation. The first time American forces had been deployed for such a mission. Cargo planes transported disaster mortuary teams from the United States, portable refrigeration units to slow decomposition, body bags sufficient for nearly 1,000 victims, and the logistical support needed to process the largest crime scene in American history, located in a remote jungle accessible only by air. The recovery itself was horrifying for everyone involved. Soldiers had to separate bodies that had fused together in the heat, had to handle remains that were liquefying from decomposition, had to bag babies and children and elderly victims, while maintaining enough emotional distance to complete the mission. Many of the recovery personnel developed PTSD from the experience, nightmares and flashbacks that persisted for decades, trauma from confronting human evil, and suffering on a scale that exceeded anything their training had prepared them for. The bodies were flown to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, where forensic pathologists worked around the clock to identify victims. The process took months. Dental records and fingerprints when available, personal effects and physical descriptions when records didn't exist, DNA testing for the most difficult cases. Many victims had identical last names because Jones had encouraged members to adopt Jones as their surname, or had taken names from each other in the communal identity system he'd established, making identification even more challenging. 210 bodies remained unclaimed after identification was complete. Either they had no living relatives, or relatives refused to claim them, unwilling to acknowledge connection to Jonestown, or unable to afford burial costs. The federal government arranged burial in a mass grave at Evergreen Cemetery in Oakland, California, purchasing 409 individual caskets and interring them together in 4 large plots. The cemetery initially refused, citing concerns about the publicity and the stigma attached to cult victims, but eventually relented after pressure from government officials and religious leaders who argued that even Jonestown victims deserved burial, The public reaction evolved over the weeks following the massacre. Initial shock gave way to attempts at understanding, with psychiatrists and cult experts offering explanations for how Jim Jones had manipulated so many people. The term brainwashing dominated discussion, though experts noted that Jones's techniques were more sophisticated than simple mind control, involving isolation, sleep deprivation, public humiliation, gradual escalation of demands, and exploitation of genuine desires for community and racial equality. The political fallout was substantial and lasting. San Francisco officials who'd praised Jones and accepted his political support faced intense criticism for enabling his operation. Mayor George Moscone, who'd been one of Jones's strongest political allies, was assassinated less than 2 weeks after Jonestown by a disgruntled former city supervisor, Dan White, in an unrelated incident that nevertheless seemed to punctuate the sense that San Francisco's progressive political establishment had failed catastrophically in recognizing Jones's danger. The trial of Larry Layton, the only person criminally prosecuted for the Jonestown murders, began in 1981 after years of legal proceedings about jurisdiction and competency. Layton had participated in the airstrip attack that killed Congressman Ryan and others, was captured at the scene, and faced charges including conspiracy to murder a congressman and aiding and abetting murder. His defense argued he was a victim of psychological manipulation. That years under Jones's control had eliminated his capacity for independent judgment. The first trial in 1981 ended in hung jury, the panel unable to agree whether someone under such extreme psychological influence could be held criminally responsible for their actions. The prosecution retried the case in 1986, this time securing conviction on multiple charges. Layton received a life sentence but served only 18 years. Released in 2002 when President Clinton commuted his sentence based on his exemplary behavior in prison and the unique circumstances of psychological manipulation that had led to his crimes. No other criminal prosecutions occurred. The primary perpetrator, Jim Jones, was dead. His closest advisors, who'd helped orchestrate the massacre, were dead. The guards who'd forced poison into resisting victims' mouths were dead. The nurses who'd administered lethal injections were dead. The system that should have prevented the tragedy. From San Francisco officials who enabled Jones to state, department officials who failed to monitor Jonestown, to Guyanese authorities who ignored abuse, faced no criminal accountability, though civil lawsuits provided some financial compensation to survivors and victims' families. The long-term impact on survivors was devastating and permanent. Most struggled with PTSD, depression, survivor's guilt, and inability to trust authority figures or institutions. Many couldn't maintain employment or relationships, their trauma so profound that normal life became impossible. Some survivors committed suicide years or decades later, unable to live with memories of what they'd witnessed or participated in. The guilt of surviving when family members died proving unbearable. Children who'd escaped Jonestown faced particularly difficult paths. They'd watched siblings and parents die, had been force-fed poison themselves in some cases, and survived when others didn't, had lost their entire communities, and been returned to a country that viewed them with mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Many struggled with addiction and mental illness, with the particular burden of being Jonestown survivors in a culture that couldn't understand what they'd experienced and often blamed them for their families' choices. The broader cultural impact has been profound and lasting. Jonestown became the defining example of cult behavior, the standard against which all other destructive groups are measured. The phrase, drinking the Kool-Aid, which is actually inaccurate since Jonestown used Flavor Aid, became common usage to describe blind acceptance of dangerous ideology. A grotesque trivialization of mass murder that keeps the memory alive while distorting what actually happened. The massacre prompted increased scrutiny of new religious movements and charismatic leaders, though the balance between religious freedom and public safety remains difficult. Jonestown showed that warning signs can be visible for years without triggering intervention, that the gap between protected religious practice and criminal abuse is wide enough for catastrophe to occur, and that by the time authorities recognize the danger, it's often too late to prevent tragedy. The Jonestown Massacre has no heroes, only victims and a perpetrator whose death denied him accountability. It has vulnerable people seeking community who found a monster and a system that failed at every level to recognize the warning signs to intervene before mass murder became inevitable to protect citizens who'd surrendered their judgment to a charismatic sociopath. Was Jim Jones insane? The psychiatric community debates this endlessly. He displayed symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia, narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and drug-induced psychosis. But he was also calculating and manipulative, capable of long-term planning and strategic thinking, able to present different personas to different audiences. Mental illness doesn't excuse mass murder, doesn't diminish responsibility for the deaths of 918 people, including 276 children. Were the members of People's Temple responsible for their own deaths? This question is cruel, but persists. They were adults who made choices, who could have left earlier, who participated in loyalty tests and practiced suicide drills that should have warned them of Jones's intentions. But they were also victims of sophisticated psychological manipulation, isolated from alternative information, financially dependent on the temple, emotionally bonded to community members, including their own children who they couldn't abandon. The uncomfortable truth is both things can be true simultaneously. People can be victims of manipulation and still bear some responsibility for their choices. Jones can be mentally ill and still be held accountable for deliberate murder. The system can have failed to protect vulnerable people, while those people also failed to recognize the danger they were in. And that moral complexity is what makes Jonestown so disturbing, because it forces us to acknowledge that monsters aren't always obvious, that victims aren't always innocent, that tragedy isn't always preventable, even when warning signs are visible. How many warning signs does a community need before intervention is justified? Jones had been investigated for tax fraud, welfare fraud, corporal punishment of children, and weapons stockpiling. Former members had provided detailed accounts of abuse. Media had begun publishing exposes. But Jones operated in the gap between criminal behavior requiring prosecution and protected religious freedom, exploiting America's reluctance to interfere with religious organizations, no matter how destructive their practices. When does religious freedom end and public safety begin? Jonestown forces this question because Jones framed everything as religious practice, as protected by the First Amendment, as persecution by a hostile establishment that opposed his progressive politics. Had authorities intervened earlier, shut down the temple, prevented the migration to Guyana, Jones would have claimed religious persecution and probably prevailed in court. The intervention only came after 918 people were dead, when protection was no longer possible. What responsibility do political leaders bear for enabling Jones? San Francisco officials who accepted his support, who praised his social programs, who appointed him to city commissions, who dismissed concerns from defectors as politically motivated attacks, they enabled his operation by giving him legitimacy. The calculation was cynical. Jones delivered votes and political muscle, so officials overlooked the abuse until it became impossible to ignore. Their moral failure was real even if their legal culpability was minimal. What about the media that initially portrayed the temple positively, that accepted Jones's narrative of progressive activism without investigating deeper? The press has responsibility to inform the public, to investigate suspicious organizations, to provide accountability for powerful figures. The media largely failed until defectors forced coverage, treating Jones as a legitimate religious and political leader rather than the dangerous cult leader he'd always been. The line between charismatic leader and dangerous cult leader, between committed religious community and totalist organization, between voluntary commitment and psychological captivity, these lines are thinner than we want to believe. And sometimes, in the darkest moments, they disappear entirely, leaving only bodies in a jungle clearing and questions that resist easy answers. If this story made you think about manipulation, vulnerability, and the human need for meaning that makes us susceptible to dangerous leaders, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about right and wrong, about free will and coercion, about how far ordinary people will go when their judgment is surrendered to charismatic authority. Comment below. What should society do when recognizing the warning signs of destructive leadership while respecting religious freedom and individual autonomy? Because these stories aren't just history. They're happening right now in communities and movements where systems fail and charisma replaces critical thinking. Until next time, remember the monsters we fear aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're made. One surrendered judgment, one ignored warning sign, one desperate decision at a time. The Jonestown Massacre has no heroes, only victims and a perpetrator whose death denied him accountability. It has vulnerable people seeking community who found a monster and a system that failed at every level to recognize the warning signs, to intervene before mass murder became inevitable, to protect citizens who'd surrendered their judgment to a charismatic sociopath. Was Jim Jones insane? The psychiatric community debates this endlessly. He displayed symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia, narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and drug-induced psychosis. But he was also calculating and manipulative, capable of long-term planning and strategic thinking, able to present different personas to different audiences. Mental illness doesn't excuse mass murder, doesn't diminish responsibility for the deaths of 918 people, including 276 children. Were the members of People's Temple responsible for their own deaths? This question is cruel, but persists. They were adults who made choices, who could have left earlier, who participated in loyalty tests and practiced suicide drills that should have warned them of Jones's intentions. But they were also victims of sophisticated psychological manipulation, isolated from alternative information, financially dependent on the temple, emotionally bonded to community members, including their own children, who they couldn't abandon. The line between victim and volunteer collapses under examination. The uncomfortable truth is both things can be true simultaneously. People can be victims of manipulation and still bear some responsibility for their choices. Jones can be mentally ill and still be held accountable for deliberate murder. The system can have failed to protect vulnerable people, while those people also failed to recognize the danger they were in. And that moral complexity is what makes Jonestown so disturbing, because it forces us to acknowledge that monsters aren't always obvious, that victims aren't always innocent, that tragedy isn't always preventable, even when warning signs are visible. How many warning signs does a community need before intervention is justified? Jones had been investigated for tax fraud, welfare fraud, corporal punishment of children, and weapons stockpiling. Former members had provided detailed accounts of abuse. Media had begun publishing exposes. But Jones operated in the gap between criminal behavior requiring prosecution and protected religious freedom, exploiting America's reluctance to interfere with religious organizations no matter how destructive their practices. When does religious freedom end and public safety begin? Jonestown forces this question because Jones framed everything as religious practice, as protected by the First Amendment, as persecution by a hostile establishment that opposed his progressive politics. Had authorities intervened earlier, shut down the temple, prevented the migration to Guyana, Jones would have claimed religious persecution and probably prevailed in court. The intervention only came after 918 people were dead, when protection was no longer possible. What responsibility do political leaders bear for enabling Jones? San Francisco officials who accepted his support, who praised his social programs, who appointed him to city commissions, who dismissed concerns from defectors as politically motivated attacks, they enabled his operation by giving him legitimacy. The calculation was cynical. Jones delivered votes and political muscle, so officials overlooked the abuse until it became impossible to ignore. Their moral failure was real even if their legal culpability was minimal. What about the media that initially portrayed the temple positively, that accepted Jones's narrative of progressive activism without investigating deeper? The press has responsibility to inform the public, to investigate suspicious organizations, to provide accountability for powerful figures. The media largely failed until defectors forced coverage, treating Jones as a legitimate religious and political leader rather than the dangerous cult leader he'd always been. The line between charismatic leader and dangerous cult leader, between committed religious community and totalist organization, between voluntary commitment and psychological captivity, these lines are thinner than we want to believe. And sometimes, in the darkest moments, they disappear entirely, leaving only bodies in a jungle clearing and questions that resist easy answers. If this story made you think about manipulation, vulnerability, and the human need for meaning that makes us susceptible to dangerous leaders, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about right and wrong, about free will and coercion, about how far ordinary people will go when their judgment is surrendered to charismatic authority. Comment below. What should society do when recognizing the warning signs of destructive leadership while respecting religious freedom and individual autonomy? Because these stories aren't just history. They're happening right now in communities and movements where systems fail and charisma replaces critical thinking. Until next time, remember the monsters we fear aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're made. One surrendered judgment, one ignored warning sign, one desperate decision at a time.